NanoHub U, online instruction.
Hey everyone, welcome to lecture 416. In the last lecture, we talked about three things. First of all, we talked about how we can model thermal transport in general. And then we talked about what is a specific modeling framework that we could use. And then, of course, that was the MATLAB toolbox that's called Phasor, which is freely available online. And then I provided the reference for that. And then third, we'd actually briefly walk through how to actually use it. Okay. And so now, with that in mind, we're going to move on to solve a specific problem. And so in this problem, we're looking at a laser diode. And so this is actually the picture of the laser diode in the upper left-hand corner. And so you can actually see the diode itself is along these lines. And then we have basically a copper alloy right here. Then a small gap between the diode and air. And then we have a heat plate made out of beryllium oxide. And then we reflect the whole system to the right-hand side through a symmetric boundary condition, like a mirror plane symmetry, like we had for the photonic crystals before. And so basically, we're going to use the same kind of equations for convection and conduction that we talked about earlier. And we're going to follow these steps. And just to briefly recap, in case you missed it last time, first we're defining the material constants and system parameters of the system. So in this particular case, of course, those materials that I just showed you. And then second, we're going to define the geometry and initiate the mesher. And so the mesher basically is what gives rise to all these little triangles. So hopefully you can see them okay. And the triangles basically determine the gridding of our system. And then we have to create the material objects or blocks of cells based on the material properties of the system so that we know like all of these regions have copper and then all these regions have beryllium oxide and so on. And then fourth, we have to apply the initial conditions. So of course, like whatever temperature the system is at before we do anything, and then create what we call the system matrices, which are associated with the solution of the problem in finite element method. And then we have to solve over time, using some sort of like additional boundary conditions or generated heat, for example, or convection and so on happening at the bottom. And so in this particular example, we're going to have both convection happening at the bottom, basically some sort of cooling fluid going through the bottom, plus heating happening from the diode being on. And so what you see actually in this kind of simulation is that the temperature will change rapidly because this is not a huge system. You can see that it's on the order of maybe like millimeters in size and in both the X and Y directions. And so in the order of micro or milliseconds, you'll actually see rapid change in the temperature distribution. Initially, it's very cool around 15 C. And so you can see actually just after fraction of a millisecond or in microseconds, it's heated up quite substantially to about 30. And that all the heat was kind of coming from over here. And then it's slowly spreading out to these other regions. Now, it's spread relatively quickly through the copper, which is not surprising just because copper is a good conductor. But then as it gets to other regions of materials, it can take much longer to heat up. And so that's kind of like something we'd expected. And so just to briefly show you again what had happened, I'm going to reiterate it once more. So you see very rapid spreading of heat out to here. But then this part, well, it's heating up gradually. It's not as fast as this part. So it's kind of interesting to see the different timescales for heating. And partially that's driven by different thermal capacity or capacitance, as sometimes it's called in analogy with circuits. And some of it's driven by the cooling that's happening at the bottom and kind of this bit of a choke point here where you can't have as much heat flow. So it gives you a very good idea of the actual physical behavior of the system when you do this sort of thing. And then here's another example, which is showing like just a simpler steady state simulation. And so what this is a thermally insulating medium. So maybe think of glass or something. and you have a variable temperature placed on one surface, and then you're looking at how the temperature propagates through that glass. And so basically what it shows is that if you have like a dip in the temperature at some specific point, like you're just cooling off like a little part of the glass, then it stays cool in that immediate vicinity, but then it kind of slowly equilibrates to what the rest of the system looks like. And then conversely, you can have local heating, and then you have a gradual spreading of that heat. And then the degree to which that spreads out depends a lot on the thermal conductivity. Of course, if it was copper instead of glass, it would actually have been much more uniform, and you wouldn't really see that sort of big peak, probably. And then just as another example, so here we have an inhomogeneous medium as opposed to a homogeneous medium. And so this actually is creating some sort of boundary condition on the top and bottom, okay, which are all uniform. But what you see that's interesting is because it's inhomogeneous, so you have regions of higher and lower thermal conduction, or if you think about it like in microscopic terms, maybe there are air gaps or whatever, then you actually have higher conduction over here on the left-hand side than on the right. And so actually you have like a gradient that's much steeper here. This is a more gradual gradient, but then this becomes much smaller, higher gradient here, and then lower gradient here, because it has to balance out at some point. But you can see it looks very inhomogeneous, even though if it was a bulk medium, then it would just be a uniform decrease as you go from here to here. Okay. So in the next lecture, we'll talk about like more sophisticated examples and also validation of this kind of modeling approach.